our goal is to create a little bit of community and, you know, bring people into the garden and an opportunity to learn more. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Ms. Sarah Sprinkle, who will introduce our guest speaker today.
Thank you for coming out today. Let me tell you that you have a treat. Rick Baldwin kicked this off for us a few weeks ago. Tim Egan's going to take it home today because I can tell you Tim is not just entertaining, but he's very enlightening. So you're going to leave here knowing more than when you came in, and you're going to have lots and lots of questions. So let me tell you a little bit about Tim.
Okay.
Tim Egan's name is synonymous with water in Winter Park.
That's what I'm shooting for.
When you talk about water, people call Tim the water guy. He's the water guy because I'm going to tell you the three things that
So I really appreciate it. We were talking about the lakes and so on. One for me was when I first moved down here was Lake Apopka, right? How it was, that has a whole history in itself. But how it was one place where we used to take kids for camping and canoeing, and then it was like, don't go near it, right?
Next one, please. So I got a call from Sarah Sprinkle, and she asked me if I would be willing to speak at this event, and I said, of course. Any excuse to come to Mead Gardens, I'm going to take them up on it. I asked her what the topic she wanted it to be, and she said something about water. So, well, first thing I did was made a list of about 27 things that we did, the city did related to water and management of water resources. And any of them would apply, but I kind of went a different direction and focused on the wildlife here at Mead Botanical Garden and why it has such a richness of native species and wildlife viewing opportunities that most people that live in cities don't have anywhere near where they actually live. So the water body that runs through this garden is known as Howell Creek. I kind of refer to it jokingly as the invisible river because people ask me all the time, where is it? It's not a showcase like a lot of cities that have a river running through them are. The entire length of Winter Park is bisected by Howell Creek. Between all of the entities, there's 2 counties and I think 8 cities that are touched by some portion of the creek. And collectively, millions of dollars are spent every year on keeping that resource healthy and in a good condition for the residents that rely on it. Howell Branch was the economic engine that really pushed the development of Winter Park and the surrounding area. They talk about all of the industry that was set up on the shores of Lake Virginia over the years, but the creek was the mechanism, the route by which all the materials got there that drove all of that economic activity. The chain also boasts what may be the oldest ecotourism operation in the region. Scenic boat tour started running in 1938. There's undocumented accounts of the glass bottom boats at Silver Springs starting in the 1800s, but nobody knows for sure what the date was that started. If we have time, I have a funny story about Silver Springs glass bottom boats, and somebody can remind me at the end if we haven't run out of time because I'm rambling. Next, please. Okay, the first thing I decided we needed to clear up was what do you call it? If you look on maps and reports from the basin related to stormwater or water runoff, you may see it called Howell Branch, you may see it called Howell Creek, or you may see it called Howell Branch Creek. So I decided to go with the Orange County Water Atlas. If they're talking about the creek, it's Howell Creek. If they're talking about the watershed, it's Howell Branch Watershed. So that's the terminology I'm going to attempt to stick with. Okay, yeah, so when you look at a map of the Winter Park area, it's easy to see why the lakes get all the attention. They're pretty much the dominant feature on any map that you look at. A gentleman named Bill Belville wrote a book about the St. Johns River in which he referred to it in the title as a river of lakes. And looking at the land drained by Howell Creek in that area, you can see that is a fitting name for Howell Branch or Howell Creek as well. And all those lakes and all those canals that the scenic boat tour runs down are all actually parts of the creek. They are just wide spots. The lakes are wide spots, and the canals are maintained portions of the creek channel. I grew up here in Central Florida on a lake in Maitland, what's now Maitland. It was unincorporated Orange County at the time. But for all the day trips we did to parks and springs and beaches, I never came to Mead Garden for some reason. When I was working in my previous job before coming to the city, we went after a project here to restore Lake Lillian, which is in the middle of the northern wetland here. And I finally got to see Mead Botanical Garden. I didn't get the job. We were beaten by my former boss on that particular project. But I would end up coming to Winter Park as an employee a couple years later, and that's where I first got into trying to manage exotic plants in a terrestrial setting. All the work I'd done before that was in lakes with aquatic plants. The one thing that amazed me about this garden is that the wildlife richness was incredible for an urban park, and a relatively small urban park, just less than 50 acres here. But as you'll see in a little bit, the wildlife viewing opportunities are just incredible here, that a lot of people that live in an urban environment are never going to really be able to experience this close to their homes. And I did want to add that unless there's a star on it, all of the animal photographs, wildlife photographs in the presentation were taken here in the Botanical Garden. So rivers and streams being linear in nature offer a kind of an automatic corridor. Corridors and greenways and blueways have become very popular amongst urban planners. Having a non-paved or a what's the word I'm looking for? Less urbanized rights of way and ways to get around the city have become very popular, very much in demand, and often drive what the cities or towns get, how they get rated as for their quality of life and whether they're considered a good place to live or not. Greenways used in general refer mostly to non-conventional methods of getting around for people. They also can apply to wildlife, although if it's specifically for wildlife, a lot of times you'll see the term wildlife corridor instead of a greenway. And that could be an overpass that allows animals to get under a busy road when they're moving from place to place. Right now, blueways are pretty much considered to be designated activity areas that are set up and identified on maps for people to enjoy paddling-based water recreation instead of power boats. Although that doesn't preclude them from being a very efficient conduit for wildlife to move through urban areas, the ones that are capable of doing so. Okay, so here's the general flow of Howell Branch or Howell watershed, the water leaving the land areas, drains to the lakes, and follows those arrows out to Lake Howell in Seminole County below us, which is above us on the map. I think you went the wrong way, Emily. I'm talking to the same slide here. No. Maybe it is. I had to do some last minute revisions, and there's going to be a couple of holes in the process here. Okay, go on to the next one. Okay, here's the red stars are approximately where we are right now, and that's the flow of the creek, or the path of the creek from Lake Sioux to Lake Virginia. In addition to the northern wetland, which is right above the red star, there's a big wetland area a little to the east of that wetland before the creek makes it out to Lake Virginia. That and a few other areas that are significantly sized wetland areas that have remained here in Winter Park are parts of the reason that the wildlife populations are as healthy as they are. This is the overall boundary of the watershed, the Howell Branch watershed. And I know that map's a little lacking in detail, but this is I-450. This is where the old Colonial Plaza was. Everything inside that red line drains to the chain, either through ditch or pipe system. Once it gets to Winter Park, or just before Winter Park, Lake Sioux is here. We split that lake. Winter Park splits that lake with Orange County and the city of Orlando. Then you've got open channel flow all the way to Lake Wampy, which is up here in the middle of the basin as far as linear run, and then to Lake Howell. Once it leaves Lake Howell, it goes on to Lake Jessup, which is the focus of a big restoration effort by the state of Florida, which helped Winter Park get a lot of grant money because we flowed to Lake Jessup. We weren't their priority, but we were able to make improvements in Lake Jessup by doing the improvements we did here for our own lakes and get credit for it and a little bit of money back in the process. Let's see. Recently, the city acquired some more wetland properties north of Lake Maitland on Howell Creek, between the lake and Lake Wampy. They probably tripled the number of wetland acres that we had under management when that happened, and it took forever to get that grant process rolling, but I believe they're actually out there doing the exotic plant control work now. So one of the things I noticed, I think what made me start to take notice of the diversity and number of wildlife sightings that were happening here at Mead Botanical Garden was when I was in the garden, I was just as likely to run into somebody from a foreign country than I was from this country, especially during the week. And they were here because they heard about the bird, and they wanted to see certain species, and the people that do that, from Orange Audubon and other organizations, and just people that are interested in it, made me start looking at the chain of lakes and Howell Creek in a little bit different way. Those little shaded areas on that map, they're not very distinct, I notice here, but all these little shaded areas are sitting on top of existing wetland stands. And those wetlands provide little island sanctuaries for migrating birds. And that also, they provide actual living conditions, living habitat for animals that use the creek and are generally aquatic or aquatic oriented. That makes a big difference in what kinds of wildlife can survive in an area. People that aren't familiar with the range that's required for animals to forage, get food and shelter and everything they need can be very large. Black bears, to have a viable population, need 200 to 300,000 acres of contiguous land, which is over 300 square miles. Gopher tortoises, which we have here in the garden, require about 250 acres, the scientists say, to maintain a viable population. Now we have breeding tortoises here, and they'll hang on for quite some time, they can, but eventually, without having the genetic diversity input from other areas, they probably would fade out of this area. And looking at that compared to the kind of acreage we have to offer in the urban environment, this garden I mentioned is 47 acres. We bought about 100 acres of wetlands up on for Howell Branch Preserve, and the city of Winter Park itself, the entire city, has a land area of about 9 square miles. So this garden is getting help from those other locations in being able to provide our residents with an ecology that supports that much wildlife. Okay, so extinction, everybody knows that extinction is that when the animals disappear from the earth here. Extirpation is a word used less often except among the wildlife scientists, but it simply is the removal of the species or for whatever cause from a particular area. They still exist elsewhere in the state or the planet, but they're not in that spot anymore. The causes of that, predation or hunting, direct mortality, that is not the typical problem. Habitat loss, on the other hand, is often the primary reason why a particular animal or group of animals does not appear in an area any longer. Climate change eventually ends up being a form of habitat loss. So I kind of put those together. The cause isn't important from that standpoint if you're looking at whether the organisms can make it here or not. And that's going to be the subject of a lot more debate going forward that I won't have to be involved in. Lastly, toxins, either chemicals dumped intentionally or accidentally by people, or things like harmful algal blooms that can occur naturally, can be exacerbated by human activity, but not necessarily. Wouldn't be here even if there were no people dumping things into the water. Okay. What was the previous one? Okay, thank you. The next one's good. And you can go on to the next one. I used to hear radio, and talk radio got going in the political mode that it's in today. I was stuck in Volusia County with an AM radio in my truck, and I heard a lot of pretty outrageous opinions on why things happen in the wild by people that had never actually been outside, I don't think. The thing I often heard was, so that some obscure fish is becoming extinct, why would we possibly care about that and spend money on it? And the reason is that we can say habitat loss was the cause of that fish becoming extinct, but what caused the habitat to go away? What did we lose in addition to that fish that somebody had just happened to be able to identify, catalog, make note of that it was there? Were there plants, other animals that went away at the same time that we didn't know about? You could have a cure for almost any disease sitting in a plant or animal out in the wild that nobody has made the connection for yet. So when things go away like that, they're going away permanently, and that's the reason we need to be worried about it, is not because that fish that we don't think is very important is worth all of the cost of protecting it, but all of the things we don't know that might be going away at the same time is what scares me and would make me want to maintain those areas to the extent possible. My last question, I'm kind of running a slide behind in my brain. It'll be more by the end. But the restoration of habitats, providing more habitat along those blueways is the way to turn them into true wildlife corridors or greenways. That's not something that's going to be done easily, probably never completely, but if cities and counties and the states take notice of the areas that are becoming marginalized by high water issues that happened in the last 2 weeks, 2 months, back-to-back hurricanes in an area that doesn't usually get a lot of landfalls. It's their third and fourth of the past 5 years, I think, in that region. Things are changing, and the opportunities appear when they appear. The money for the purchase of that land up on Howell Branch Preserve wasn't really expected. We've had lots of those set-asides for purposes similar to that put into the budget, only to be line item vetoed by the governor. So I really didn't expect that money was going to ever show up here. So you never know when the opportunities are going to arise, and you need to be able to take advantage of them when they do. So the primary functions of wetlands in our ecosystems are flood storage. Almost all wetlands and creeks have a floodplain associated with them, an area that fills up during large storm events, large runoff events that may not otherwise be that high. The top two pictures are of the same spot in Howell Branch or in Howell Creek, right at the corner of the confluence with Alice's Pond, right down below at the bottom of the hill here. The picture on the left with all the sand and no water at all, great egret looking for water, was taken exactly a week before the picture on the right. We had one large storm event that hit this basin pretty good and got the area upstream of us pretty good. And a few days later, that's what the creek looked like. And that's how our creek here, Howell Creek, and all of our lakes are, except for possibly the sinkhole, Lake Rose over in MLK Park. They're all groundwater driven. The groundwater comes from rainfall, and when the water table drops far enough, the lake or the canal or the stream segment will go dry. And when it gets wet, it comes back. They also serve wetlands too as a nutrient sink. Everybody talks about carbon and what a problem it is for climate change. The sediments in wetlands, particularly the ones with deep mucky soils, are extremely rich in carbon. That's why the muck is all black. It's a lot of organic material, plants and animals that over the decades and centuries accumulated in those low-lying areas. If we go in and dig those up, we've got to be really careful because that's a lot of carbon and also with it a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus that could very easily end up in your water column heading downstream to your nearest lake. So you've been doing something that you consider an environmental restoration or improvement, and you could be not necessarily improving it any for the wildlife and possibly causing damage downstream. Lastly, habitat. It's many of our native wildlife, migratory birds, animals, and other birds that live here year-round rely on these wetland areas for habitat. And when the habitat goes, they go. And so that is the three primary functions of wetlands that, from a management standpoint, in urban areas. You want to hit the next one? So what are the impacts to those functions? Drainage. This particular wetland just north of this building had a ditch cut through the natural berm that existed between the creek and the wetland. And that caused the wetland to not hold water as long, for as long of a period during the year as it did before. This can result, if you combine that with a drought, those organic sediments that were there in the wetlands start to shrink up. The organic material gets oxidized and the soils tend to shrink. And that's what happened in that top picture with the red maple that subsequently fell over. But you can see the soil pulled away pretty significantly from those roots over the years. And when Hurricane Charlie hit in 2004, there wasn't anything left to hold that tree up. This is kind of a mild look at skunk vine, the bottom picture. When first time I walked out here as an employee, that just looked like rolling green hills. You couldn't tell. You knew there were trees under there somewhere, but you couldn't tell what they were. So the first thing we did was, now I'm 2 slides behind. Okay, hydro period improvement. That ditch was an easy fix, or would have been an easy fix if it wasn't for the St. John's River Water Management District. And this is not their fault. This is what happens in urban areas when creeks and lakes get modified. There's a lot of residential neighborhoods around this garden. And we didn't want to go in and do something that was going to cause somebody's house to flood. So when you start messing around with water levels, that's the risk you take. So the Water Management District looked at it. We thought it was safe to go up about 2 or maybe even 3 feet based on the topography of the area and where the neighborhoods sit and relative to the creek. The Water Management District was comfortable with 1. So if we had the money to do a model, we probably could have gotten them to come up another foot if we could show that those houses were going to flood. But that was going to be a very expensive model. We didn't have any survey of that system and the details that would be needed to get to that level. We decided to take our foot and go home, and that's what we did. But it has made a difference. That wetland generates a lot less skunk vine than it did before because those seeds are sitting in standing water now when they would normally be germinating. And it seems like there's been a surge in native tree recruitment out there as well. Okay, exotic species control. I talked about that a little bit. The picture kind of in the middle there, it's got jammed up a little bit. You can see a lot of brown vegetation there. That's all skunk vine from the first treatment we did out here. And the first treatment we did was pretty much broadcast spraying the entire wetland. We went in first and cut the ascending vines manually through that entire wetland by hand. And some of those guys still don't talk to me. But that allowed us to spray at ground level so we weren't putting herbicide up where the trees would be able to be impacted by it. There was very little native ground cover anywhere in that wetland. It was shaded so heavily by the vine. The next stage was reforestation. managing vine-like vines that are a problematic plant like skunk vine is much easier when you have a canopy to work under. The canopy slows the growth of the vine, also gives you tree trunks that you can see where the vines are going, and you can take them out a lot easier. Cuts down the amount of herbicide you have to use in the environment, and makes for a kind of a short-circuiting of the process. It gets you there a little quicker than if you try to just attack the vine itself with only control methods. So we planted 600 coastal plain willows. Most of them have run their course of their upward growth, and they're starting to sprawl in the wetland. And that's leaving openings for the sweet bay magnolia that used to dominate this wetland, and the red maples to come in. And in the picture of the boardwalk there at the bottom, that's about all you see is native trees out there. There might be a red bud or two snuck back in that we haven't caught yet. But when you walk down the boardwalk, you see mostly native plants, both in the ground cover and in the canopy. And that was a very cost-effective method. It takes a while. I mean, you have to let nature do its job and let it have its way. But you end up with a much easier to maintain system and a much more natural system, in my opinion. So there's going to be a lot of pictures of animals coming up, so mostly birds. And this is not intended to be an inventory. If you want to know all the birds that are out here, Larry Martin with Orange Audubon can tell you all about it, how many species they see in a day out here, which is some tremendous amount, like 80 or something like that. That's the record. And I've got a lot of qualitative information in there. I don't have a lot of numbers. I wasn't much of a research scientist in my career, and I'm much less of one now. So these are observations and my reaction to those observations. So start with invertebrates. Honeybees have been in the news a lot because of possible impacts from herbicide use. The pollinators are the main reason we have produce stands. Without something to pollinate those plants, we would just have plant stands. And the hive in the inset picture there was actually a wild honeybee hive that was here at Mead Botanical Garden for the past year and a half or so. I think the hurricanes or maybe even the cold before we got it, but we used to go out and check it every now and then. Couldn't resist taking the picture every time, but that helped bolster it. That was an example of the wildlife coming to us and taking advantage of what was here. Okay, this is a disjointed slide. It doesn't quite match where I was going, but we'll talk about this. The volunteer effort out here is huge. When Emily said she's the director of programs and volunteer coordination, that's a huge job, just the volunteer coordination part. The people want to come out, they want to be productive, and they want to make a difference. But some of this stuff isn't intuitive to everybody, and they need to be trained to do it properly. So it's a lot of work to get them to commit to it, to get them to come out, to get them to actually start pulling skunk vine or some other part of the effort that's needed, and stick with it and do it right. The butterfly garden, I think, was the first created garden that I took notice of out here. And there were so many butterflies, you couldn't help but take notice of it if you walked through that area. And that was because the people that designed it did a great job of making sure that the plants at the larval stage of that butterfly like to eat is there in the garden. And the zebra longwing on the right, the caterpillars will eat that passion flower vine down to nothing in about 5 minutes until you get enough of the biomass growing out there to support them. And the monarch butterfly, which is a migratory butterfly, wants milkweed for its caterpillar, and they did a good job of providing that as well. Okay, the fact that butterflies can fly is one of the reasons why we have a good representation of the butterflies here. All those little wetland areas and natural areas that are adjacent to the creek are accessible very easily to animals that can fly. And as you'll hear more about that as we go on, because that makes a difference on what you're going to see or not see here at the garden.
You're good.
Okay, thank you. And not all insects are pollinators. We have a large variety of dragonflies that make their home here in the park. These animals can live for 4 to 7 years as an aquatic larva before they become flying dragonflies. And once they do become flying dragonflies, they might only live for a day as an adult. Some of them live for, I think, up to several weeks, but I don't know that there's any that live longer than that. Nancy? Nancy's the person I asked for identifications on all the things I can't identify myself. So. Anyway, the dragonflies, keeping them around is beneficial for us because they eat a lot of gnats and mosquitoes and anything else they can get a hold of. They're pretty brutal predators. They look very pretty, but when they want to eat gnats, the gnats better get out of the way. We also are home, the creek itself, to a lot of mollusks. The freshwater mussels that are carpeting the bottom there, that's the little run from the creek under the concrete bridge to Alice's Pond, are filter feeders, and they are capable of removing a lot of nutrients and pollutants from the water column. They also kind of need reasonably clean water to exist in large numbers. So they're one that if we keep our runoff as clean as we can, then they'll do the rest of the job and help keep the creek as clear as they can. The apple snail, the other snail mollusk that was in that picture was the apple snail. It's not a filter feeder, but a grazer. But they are a very integral part of the ecosystem here that we'll talk about them again in a little bit. This is the snake that probably is the most adaptable to urban living. It's a black racer. They come out in the middle of the day and hunt lizards, and they do a great job of keeping the invasive Caribbean anoles at reasonable population levels. Anybody that's lived in Florida for more than 30 years probably remembers that when they walked outside, they didn't see brown lizards scurrying on the sidewalk. They saw green lizards on their screen. Those are the native anole, the green anole. It can change its color from green to brown. If you have trees nearby, you'll still see some. They're more arboreal than the Caribbean imports, but they're still around. You just don't see them as much. The Caribbean lizards, for some reason, don't like to climb more than about so high on the tree trunks. So, reptiles. I had some text there that is no longer there. We had technical difficulties last night. That alligator was in a retention pond out at the Central Utilities compound that was not here at Mead, but alligators do occur here at Mead. And we like to make sure that everybody's aware of that because we don't necessarily, the Parks Department did not necessarily call to have alligators removed unless they thought there was a specific danger rather than just the general one of animals live here. Feeding wildlife is one of the reasons why they have to be destroyed. So that was a big push of ours in the environmental education program, was keeping people, or trying to keep people from the temptation to feed alligators, ducks, squirrels, anything else. And we know how fun it is to do that, so we tried not to be militant about it, but it didn't help anybody, especially with alligators. We have a lot of turtles in Florida, and these are mostly, I think a good percentage of those are natives. We have 2 or 3 native turtles that have a similar appearance. All of these turtles, when they're little, look like the little pet store turtles that kids would get, and parents would go looking for one that looked the same after it died, and they didn't want to tell them it was kid. There's a couple here. You can see the little red mark on that turtle's head. Those are red-eared sliders. They're native to the Mississippi River Basin. So they're not exotics to North America, but they are exotic to Florida. The first time I ever went to the condo building, there's two condos here, and I'm not sure which one has the big pond in the middle, but it was full of red-eared sliders. And whenever anybody walked down to the pond, every turtle in the pond swam to them. They thought they were going to be fed. As far as I can tell, all of Howell Branch watershed and probably most of the St. Johns River watershed have red-eared sliders in them, but they still don't show up in any of the guidebooks, field guides and things. So someday grad students will probably get a nice master's project out of studying those red-eared sliders. I don't know what happened to here. This is one of my technical problems. Anyway, these the two pictures on the right are Florida softshell turtle, and the little guy here on the left, he's about as big as my hand, and that's full grown, that's an adult, a mud turtle. And we have several species of turtles that look like that, dark shell, just a really simple domed shell, not a lot of spectacular markings or anything. But you'll find them in wetlands during the dry season, walking around, or you'll see them swimming and walking around your dock underwater at night if you're out and about. These animals are aquatic, largely aquatic, almost entirely aquatic, but they do require dry land to lay their eggs. So much like sea turtles on the beach, these turtles, the females during the nesting season will trudge up the hill as far as they think is appropriate. Some of them get really ambitious. The snapping turtle in the back of the pickup truck there was in the middle of denning when I was driving in one morning from an event. So she got to ride back to the pond in the truck. If they stay out on the road too long, everybody knows what happens. And so I've had a tendency over the years to stop for turtles, and I've only almost killed people once or twice doing that. So I think that's it. Not all turtles are aquatic. I didn't get the rest of the text in here, but the gopher tortoise, which we have a number of them with burrows here at the garden. If you don't see the turtle, you can always go see the burrows. They like to come out in the middle of the day a lot, so if you want to see them out and about, early to mid-afternoon is often a good time for that. So the turtle here is a Florida box turtle or an eastern box turtle. They're not as prevalent in the area as they used to be. They don't seem to do as well in urbanized areas as gopher tortoises do. However, they are around. And the first volunteer event I did out here was with a group of students from Valencia Community College. And I had to stop 3 separate groups of students from putting that box turtle in the creek. So, and I saw them walk by, and where are you going with that? Well, we're going to put them back in the water. And growing up chasing turtles and snakes, I found it completely unusual that somebody would not know a land turtle from a water turtle. But since then, I've learned that a lot of people don't know that because they've never come in contact with them. So. Okay, banded water snake is one of the most common snakes we have here in Florida. You don't usually see them out in the daytime. If you lift your canoe up on the side of the lake, you might find one curled up underneath your canoe. I've found that 99% of the banded water snakes that had their heads chopped off were assumed to be water moccasins because they live near a lake. We do have water moccasins. I've never seen one here in Winter Park, but they do like flowing systems. So Howell Branch watershed with the ditches and creek channels and things probably has some water moccasins in it. But they're not as prevalent as they are in like flowing swamp systems up north of here in Volusia County and parts of Seminole County. So, and the guy hiding behind the arrowhead stem is a native anole, the green lizard I was talking about. He thinks he's hidden. But both of these animals are favorite food for other animals that live here in the park. So in addition to hunting, they have to kind of watch watch their six a lot and make sure there's not somebody sneaking up on them. Birds, probably the most looked at animals on the planet. They move around, they're big enough to see with you don't need a microscope or magnifying glass. They're colorful, and they're very photogenic. So again, this is an instance where the bird population is noticeable and big here because of the connections to all those other natural areas here in Central Florida, and the fact that the birds are capable of flight. Birds of prey, these are birds that eat small animals of various kinds, small mammals, they'll eat reptiles, red-shouldered hawks. I've seen them eat snakes and turtles very often. And the owls, mostly nocturnal, but they also are pretty good at picking up rabbits and squirrels and things like that while they're out hunting. Swallowtail kite is the bird up in the upper right, one of the coolest predators out there. If they got chores to do, they're good at multitasking. They'll be out flying with the family, teaching Junior how to fly, and carrying a mouse or something with them and eating on the fly as they're doing that. When you see one do that, it takes a while to figure out what they're doing, and then it's like, oh, that's pretty neat. Okay. We have migratory and and resident birds here. The white-eyed vireo, is that what that was? Skyhorn is a migrant. This time of year, you can walk out and see lots of small, colorful birds or small drab birds in the trees. Many biology students never wanted to learn about these birds because they're very difficult to identify until you get used to it. It only took me about 20 years to get a hang of the ones that Nancy would teach to me, but the people that didn't want to have anything to do with them just called them LBJs. They were little brown jobs, and that's as far as they would go. So, next. A lot of birds with specialized behaviors. The anhinga, juvenile anhinga on the drying his wings is an aquatic hunter that they swim for their meals. A lot of times you'll just see their head and long neck sticking out of the water, and that's how they got the nickname snakebird that a lot of people use to describe them. The wood stork in the top right there is a low water specialist. If you have a drought and you have water bodies drying up, these birds will show up out of nowhere and start cleaning out the concentrated fish and other small organisms that are in there. This guy had a cool technique. He would swoop his wing out to shade an area and scare the fish, but he'd also use his foot on the same side to wriggle the bottom to get them up and moving. And that you'd see that beak, you'd hear that beak snap shut every time something got inside that they could feel in there. Belted kingfisher is a very colorful resident here. Also very effective fishermen. They didn't get named inappropriately. They're very good at snagging small minnows off the surface of the water, and you'll hear them more than see them because they've got a very noxious cry, and they yell at anybody who gets near their particular perch of the day. Some of these birds, native birds, help us with our exotic species control. That egret, great egret or common egret, sticking his head out from behind a tree is probably the most photographed egret in the state of Florida. He's probably down at Alice's Pond right now if anybody wants to get a picture before they go. But those birds have taken to walking the hedges on roadways, medians and shoulders, hunting the Caribbean lizards that are so prevalent in those areas. And I never saw them do that before until the density of the lizard population got up high enough to make it worth their effort. But you see quite a bit of it now, and it's not uncommon. It used to be very uncommon to see one of these birds away from the water, but it happens all the time now. That juvenile anhinga's got an armored catfish. This is one of the sucker fish you would put in your aquarium, and they'd be about this long, to eat the algae off the glass. And then sometime before they got to be that long, they would get thrown out with the aquarium as it was being cleaned or disposed of. And unfortunately, we've got a breeding population here in Mead Botanical Garden and the rest of the Howell Branch watershed. The limpkin is this bird on the right. He's kind of not real colorful, but kind of interesting looking bird. Very nocturnal. You can hear their cries at night as they walk around shorelines, looking for their favorite food, which is the Florida apple snail and the native freshwater mussels that occur here in our waterways. And they're very skilled at opening those organisms and getting out the morsels that they want. The city of Winter Park had an exotic snail problem on a small lake. The lake was isolated from our other lakes. So we thought we could get control of that by taking out the eggs that they laid. You saw the egg cluster maybe in that one picture that we blew past. Their egg cluster was very distinct and colorful, so you could see it. So we had volunteers out there. We had staff out there, we had scuba divers out there. We would take bucketfuls of snails, and they got to be almost as big as a baseball out of that pond. And the next year they would be back at the same density, it seemed like, until a family of limpkin showed up, and within 6 months we couldn't find an exotic apple snail in the pond. So that was quite the help. All right, migration, bird migration occurs twice a year. Many species travel hundreds of thousands of miles to winter grounds where they typically driven by food supply running out as the cold weather set in up north. The variety and color of these birds is amazing, and it's easy to see once you've seen a few of them why people become so addicted to bird watching. I guess I categorize them based on type of bird. So we got some ducks here, migratory ducks, the wood ducks, the mergansers, and the two mallards that were too busy eating the bugs for my picture. Some of the wood ducks and mallards are domesticated or have become domesticated. They don't really migrate anymore. The mallards in particular also will hybridize with Muscovy ducks and other domestic ducks, which the Fish and Wildlife Commission does not like to happen because it dilutes the gene pool. All right, next. So I've noticed that, and it could just be an increase in effort, birding effort, but I hear every year of birds being spotted here in Mead Botanical Garden that have never been identified here before. It doesn't mean they weren't here before and just nobody happened to see it and document it. But they also could have been new recruits that have just come in and have never been here before. That Howell Creek, Howell Branch watershed conduit is the primary vehicle that I think attracts those birds to this area. Our habitat restoration efforts here have been very robust, and as the years have gone on, we got more native plant species here in the garden. The bird variety and number seems to have gone up quite a bit. Okay, mammals. Mammals are large. Most of the mammals that are large predators need large areas in which to hunt. The one animal that we have that's very mobile and a pretty large predator is the river otter. They're a lot of fun to watch. If they take up residence in your covered boat or your boathouse, they're not so much fun anymore, but they're very playful. Unfortunately, they're somewhat misunderstood. I've found more than one shot in the lakes. When I started here in 1997, there were still people trapping them here. We would find skinned otter carcasses, and they were able, because of their ability to take advantage of the entire system, all of the lakes, and not just the ones in Winter Park, the ones upstream of Winter Park, downstream of Winter Park. They can move, they go through the storm drains from lake to lake. They're very adept at surviving in urban areas. And the catfish that the one on top is eating had just been stocked a couple weeks earlier by the Game Commission at MLK Park for the fishing event. But he decided to start early. Smaller mammals, Florida cottontail rabbit and marsh rabbit, gray squirrel and sleepy raccoons, are able to get around urban areas because they're sneaky. They'll live in small stands of hedges that are dense, up in trees in the yard. And they seem to be able to move through urban areas pretty well. So it'll be a long time before the rabbits and squirrels and raccoons are gone. But I think they'll continue to persist as they have.
Oh.
And this is my last section of organisms I want to talk about. Trees. The city of Winter Park and most of the cities around us have fairly robust tree rules. I think they may still be being sorted out a little bit with the state law changing a couple of years ago, but I think they've got those details worked out. And as you can see from this trunk of this bald cypress tree in Craft Azalea Garden, that there is a huge amount of vertical diversity in a tree canopy that these animals, birds, and other organisms can take advantage of. And in order for the tree canopy that Winter Park has, that is so popular and so effective at allowing wildlife to persist in this area, they really need to have as diverse of a tree canopy as possible. Pine trees dominated this area before it was developed. Live oaks and laurel oaks dominate it now. Without being judgmental, the species composition of your canopy, the more it resembles what was there prior to development, the more success you're going to have in having wildlife species persist in your area. And these are just a couple pictures of birds that stop by in the spring on their way out of town. The goldfinches will sit in the garden for days at a time eating seeds off the willow trees. They're blooming about the time that these birds are getting ready to leave. And that's a male that's just starting to get his yellow feathers in. And by the time they're nice and bright yellow and you see why they're called goldfinches, they're out of here. So you catch them for a few seconds. The other was a cedar waxwing eating the berries off of sable palm, which is our state tree. And this is actually a sunrise and a sunset on Lake Maitland. And I think I'm done talking. I apologize for the circuitous route we took to get to some of these points, but we had 2 hurricanes clear.
Thank you, Tim. Do we have questions for Tim? Yes, sir, please.
There's, in the past couple of years, there's always been the rumor of coyotes in the park and also in Winter Park. How much of that was really just rumor and how much was reality?
Excuse me. Diet Pepsi down the wrong pipe. Yeah, if you didn't hear the question he asked about coyotes, excuse me, if they are here. I've never seen a coyote blind. I think I saw one 2 days ago. It was the first time I've seen them live. And standing somewhere. It was on the side of I-95. I've seen some dead ones here and there that got hit by cars. But I've also spoken to residents that live on Howell Branch or on Howell Creek, north of Howell Branch Road. And they're apparently denning in the creek bank down there. And whenever a fire truck goes by with a siren on, they all start howling. That's how he knows when they're still around. Before I moved, we lived in Altamont Springs, right near here. And there was a lady in the neighborhood that fed feral cats, so we had lots of feral cats. But every once in a while you notice there weren't so many feral cats, and it was about the same time I started noting evidence of coyotes in my backyard. And so they're around. They they subsidize their diet with pet food and garbage that people leave out. Unintentionally, they're not trying to feed coyotes, but they don't have to follow the normal predator-prey relationship. If they can't catch enough to eat that week, they go steal some leftover dog food from the neighborhood or something like that.
One thing I read about coyotes is that some of these animals, like the black bear and so on, is that they've learned to live within the urban environment. And so, because they go into trash cans or whatever, so they've been able to survive in the urban environment because the opportunities are there. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
Jim, when I was a child, there were still a fair number of dirt streets in Winter Park, and the Sentinel Hotel had guests. At that time, you could see 20 feet through our lakes, and most of the aquatic plants were submerged, and since then they've gone through a hyper-eutrophic stage that you're all too familiar with. Can you comment on where the water quality is today
Sure.
in light of the recent past?
Sure. I would say when I started here, but because this was not an individual effort, but the city had a fairly robust aquatic plant management program in the past before I got here, and they were really just getting started in the water quality issue. They had done a master plan, and they were fairly judicious about working through that master plan step by step. They targeted the larger outfalls, and it wasn't just based on size, it was based on the nutrient load. They actually sampled all the stormwater coming in, they sampled the ambient water quality in the lakes, and they targeted upstream to downstream because you get more benefit treating upstream first because you're getting that clean water trickling down all the time. And also in the size of the nutrient load that was being put out by that particular pipe or canal or ditch. And within about 10 years of initiating a really aggressive stormwater management program and aquatic plant management program, not just aquatic plant removal, we were actively encouraging the growth of native plants at the same time that we were taking out the hydrilla, which was the primary pest plant in our lakes. We had clearer water. The annual average had crept up from about 1 to about 2. I was getting phone calls from people telling me how great the lake looked and keep up whatever we're doing. A couple of years later, we had several lakes that had gone to 3 meters and beyond. And I had people that lived on a lake with 2 meters that were calling me up telling me how horrible the lake looked and why wouldn't we come and do something about it. So perception has a lot to do with it. And my goal when I looked at the lakes was to get the annual average in all our lakes to be at 2 or better. And we actually got there pretty quickly and to some degree accidentally. We were targeting phosphorus in almost all of our activities because nitrogen is hard to remove from the system. There's so much of it around. But our nitrogen levels dropped by almost 50% between the time I started here in 1997 and by the time we started seeing statistically valid changes in our water quality, which was around 2003, 2004 timeframe. All of these lakes bounce up and down now. They're probably at the level where we can realistically get them in this urban setting. We still have a lot of runoff that comes into and dust that blows off of roofs when it's not raining. So I think that they are about where they want to be and where we can get them. And it's a constant battle. Sometimes they're going to get a bloom, sometimes they're going to be crystal clear. And I think that's probably what we're in for the near future until we get some better technology or other ways to deal with it.
Thank you.
Question in the back and then Sue.
After Hurricane Ian, Lake Maitland was really high. Within about 2 weeks, it was down a good foot and a half. Was it discharged?
Yes. The outfall for the chain of lakes is a weir at Howell Branch Creek. That weir is basically 2 box culverts that are about 20 feet wide. So you've got 40 feet of weir crest that the water flows over. Once the water gets up close to near the 100-year flood elevation for the chain, there's about 1.5 foot of water over that 40 feet of weir flowing. So it's a huge volume of water that's leaving the system at that point. It would take probably 3 Ians to add enough water to the system to get it to go higher than that 100-year flood, but it'll get there relatively quickly with enough water coming down.
Sue?
The eelgrass crop this year has been greater than I have ever seen. Every 3 or 6 weeks, I'm paying $600 for somebody to come by and put it all on my dock. What has caused that crop to be so ample?
Okay, now you're going to get into some real speculation on my part, but there's always been eelgrass in these lakes since I've been managing them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a healthy plant, right?
Yeah, but the first lake I had trouble with it on was Lake Killarney, which was a grass carp lake in the past. Grass carp are an Asian fish that are sterilized during the egg fertilization process and are used to help keep hydrilla under control. We were never able to use them in the chain because the system was open and they didn't want the fish going downstream and causing problems in other water bodies where they didn't need them eating the plants. The state changed its mind on that in around 2010 when we had problems with herbicide resistance. Not just one active ingredient, but 2 active ingredients that were commonly used. There was really only about 4 that were effective on hydrilla at all. And there was a risk of a very hardy plant spreading downstream into the St. Johns River from the Winter Park chain. So we went in with low levels of grass carp and continued the herbicide program on concentrations of hydrilla that were big enough to treat. And we were able to get the hydrilla back under to a maintenance level of control. But I did notice on a lot of lakes, the eelgrass just got really happy. Lake Killarney, it was growing to the surface and then laying over and growing another 4 or 5 feet like it does in spring runs. Never seen it do that in a lake anywhere else, including the other lakes that we've been having problems with. But I suspect that there's a balance point between the number of carp in the lake and the diversity of plants in the lake. So in a lot of lakes where we have eelgrass, but we don't have floating eelgrass problems, we have a significant coverage of other plants, other native plants in the lake, in addition to the eelgrass. When those plants are gone, because they were more susceptible to the treatment program we were using, then that empty space gets taken up by whatever does want to be there, which it appears to be the eelgrass. And that plant normally pops up out of the ground in places. It's got a very buoyant root system, because that's one of the means in which it propagates itself and moves around the state.
There's a question in the back, the gentleman in the back. Yes, sir?
Yes, thanks for the presentation, Tim. It was fabulous.
Yes.
And I think it gives us a better appreciation of the Mead Botanical Garden also. We have Howell Branch Preserve that we recently have started to try to clean it up and maybe make it accessible. What kind of future would you see would be good for Howell Branch Preserve?
It's a fascinating portion of the creek system. It's surrounded by urbanization, Howell Branch Road, and all the neighborhoods up in the Tuscarora area and Maitland. But when you get down in there on the creek itself, on a canoe, or just standing on the bank, you feel like you're in the middle of nowhere. It's really cool. The birds activity is great. There's fishing that can be done during high water periods. But it's a small system. It's a small run of a small system. I can see if the kayak canoe launch is built that they wanted to have, there might be a few people kayaking it on any given day. But right now, they would have to paddle downstream, and then, because there's a weir immediately upstream of that area, and then they'd have to turn around and paddle back up against the current if they wanted to get back to where they started. So it'll be a destination for people that are kind of trip-oriented paddlers and just couldn't get out to the big rivers, and they were home for Thanksgiving or something and decided to go out on the creek. Any type of trail that we put in there, just from the use of the other trails I've been associated with, MLK and Ward Park, and if we do it right, or if the city does it right, I think it'll get used heavily as a jogging and walking area.
Yes, ma'am.
My question was about those weirs. Can you explain exactly how they work?
Sure.
I mean, you sort of, I think I sort of understand
Okay,
both
well,
levels, but.
Technically, that weir is adjustable, but it's not really adjustable for water level changes, at least not quick water level changes. It's more for maintenance purposes. There's gates that go up and down, but they open from the bottom. They don't drop down from the top, and that makes a difference in how fast you're going to affect the water level by opening them. So they're operated. The permit from the St. Johns River Water Management District requires that it stay at its current elevation. So we're not even allowed to raise it or lower it under the terms of the permit. But essentially, it's just a wall that backs up water until the water gets above the top of that wall, and then it spills over.
And why were they put in?
Water level control, basically.
So it doesn't go
They
too
can
far down.
Regulated
not-
more than-
Well, to keep it at an more even elevation. It's very inconvenient for someone with a boat dock where the water is 10 feet waterward of their actual boat. You put it down in the mud, it doesn't do much. But there's a lake management detriment to keeping the lakes regulated in a tight elevation range. Before there was a lot of development and a lot of people living on houses on lakes in Florida, the plants assemblages around the shoreline would change naturally as the water levels went up or down. Floating leaf plants like the white water lily, the fragrant water lily in particular, really like static lake levels, and they'll take off in huge stems and cover large portions of even fairly large lakes. Where if those lakes were allowed to stage up a couple more feet like they used to, every 10 years or so, those populations of fragrant water lily would end up floating because the
system.
buoyancy of the roots would pop them out of the muck sediments. And we've got some lakes where that happens, and you can go on the property appraiser's website and find a lake with a lot of stands of the lilies, and just go back through the years of aerials, and you'll see kind of round holes in the lily pad stands. And that's where they're popping up from. So.
And so who, in whose interest is it to keep the weirs? Because I'm sort of gathering that you're getting back to the days where they weren't there.
The people that live on and use the lakes, I mean, they're very popular lakes and boat ramps. Whatever parking is available on the weekends is full. And there's a lot of people out there in the evenings on paddle boards now, people using that lake. I found that when people look at a lakefront property, wherever the water is, first day they looked at it, that's where it's supposed to be. And if it moves up or down an inch, my phone would ring. And I had people tell me it's time to turn the valve off, and I was like, okay, what valve? Well, you're giving all of our water to Seminole County. I told them I'd blame Isaac Newton because gravity was taking it, but they still don't.
I have one more question. Go ahead.
Thanks. Hi, I live on Lake Killarney, and we have residents that have been there for 30 years, but our little lane is flooding now on a regular basis, even with regular thunderstorms. And I wonder if you could speak to how that lake level is managed. Somebody told me there were drains into the aquifer, and then also, have you noticed in your water management the sediment that is blocking, our area near Killshore Lane, because our street, even on a regular thunderstorm now, is completely overflowing.
Are you in the city limits or?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I would get someone from the stormwater division out there to look at it. We dredged those outfalls 10, 12 years ago now. They wouldn't surprise me that they would need it again. The system is not very well mapped. We inherited a lot of undocumented storm pipes when we annexed areas down in Fairbanks and Lee Road. And some of those pipe systems are connected in ways that wouldn't normally be, and they're hard to find and hard to get nailed down what's really going on. But as far as the drainage wells go, there were 2 drain wells on Lake Killarney when I started working here, over on the southwest corner of the lake, and they were both failing. The casings were rotted out, and they were afraid that they were going to get blocked and not take water at some point. So the county dug. The Water Management District wouldn't permit wells of the size of the ones that were there originally. So to get the equivalent drainage, they had to put in 3 smaller wells for each of the old wells. So they got 6 drain wells out there now. And the first thing that happened was the lake started regulating itself at about 1.5 foot lower than it had during normal wet periods before. We didn't have the easiest time coordinating with the county on trying to come up with a solution, but finally found a way to do that. I believe Winter Park is going to be annexing some of that area on that where those drain wells are, but the county's already given the operation of those wells to the city of Winter Park. So I would talk to the stormwater engineer and see what they've got going or what they know about and don't know about. But a lot of the problems with the lake flooding are related to, or being too low, are related to the way those drain wells get operated. What you're describing may very well be a blockage in the pipe that's just not taking the water, and that is, unless it's the whole pipe failing, then it should be a relatively easy fix.
Thank you.
Hence the applause for